think we'll go ahead and get started. All right, hello and welcome to CampusGuard's webinar on developing an effective security awareness training program. My name is Kathy Staples and I'm the marketing manager here at CampusGuard. Tess Meyer is our marketing specialist. She's also here to monitor any questions. And thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar will be recorded and everyone who registered will receive an email with the link to the recording. So look out for that in the next couple of days. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat. We will be monitoring it and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible after the presentation. If we don't get to yours, we'll go ahead and follow up with you after the webinar. We'd also like to know your thoughts about today's content, so please take a couple of minutes after the webinar to complete a brief survey and give us your feedback. So today we have 3 IT security and compliance experts who will be discussing strategies on how to implement an effective security awareness program in your organization. Also help identify and prioritize risks in your environment and help you meet evolving compliance requirements and more. So let's introduce today's presenters. Katie Johnson is the product lead for CampusGuard online training and is responsible for coordinating the delivery of PCI compliance and IT security services. Chad Wheeler manages CampusGuard's new Red Lens InfoSec division, certified professionals who provide penetration testing, vulnerability scanning, and security assessments to our customers. We also have Margaret Gochter, who is the CampusGuard security advisor, and she specializes in PCI DSS, FERPA, HIPAA, GLBA, and other compliance requirements, as well as vendor risk assessments and IT policy management. And with that, I'll turn it over to Katie.
Awesome. Thanks, Kathy. And thanks everybody again. I'm sure you had lots of meetings today, so I'm glad you took the time to join us this afternoon. But considering you made the decision to sign up for this webinar, I think we can all agree that security awareness training is definitely a critical element of any organization's information security program. And we know the point of training is to help educate users and in the end prevent risk. But with escalating threats, limited funding, and what seems like kind of dwindling resources everywhere, sometimes it can be hard to decide really where exactly you should start and then how best you should build and structure your organization's training cycle. So today we are planning to provide some guidance for you around identifying the more immediate risks and priorities for your organization. We want to talk about some ongoing compliance requirements and the different types of training that you must provide to your employees in order to meet those requirements. We'll discuss how to create quality training content. You definitely don't want to just provide training for training's sake, but you want to make sure it's providing real value to your employees. We'll talk a little bit about balancing the frequency of required training and updates against all of the other daily tasks and jobs your employees have. Share some ideas for gaining support and strategies for enforcing training requirements and deadlines. And then lastly, we want to cover how to measure the overall effectiveness of the program and calculate your return on investment. So I know that's quite a bit to cover. Hopefully by the end, you'll have learned some helpful tips for your program. And at the end, like Kathy said, please utilize the chat to send in questions and I'll try to address most of those at the end as we can. All right. So to kick things off, when you're looking at developing or revamping your current awareness training program, our first recommendation is really just to kind of take a step back, review and determine what the biggest risks are within your different environments, and then determine what areas would result in the most damage if they were to be compromised. So whether formally or informally, your organization really should be conducting those risk assessments on an annual or a regular basis. And you can use the output and the details that you uncover during those reviews to then identify the more immediate risks facing your organization. From there, you can really start to prioritize which areas or systems pose the most significant risk and look at the likelihood of compromise. And then you can assign an overall weight to each one. You can start to identify specific data types that could be exposed. So you really want to start thinking about, where your PHI data might be, where you have research data, where you have credit card information, where you have student information, any of those sensitive data types. And from there, you can start targeting those employees that are responsible for accessing those identified systems or handling those sensitive or critical data types. And then you can determine how best to ensure they understand kind of how to protect that information and their roles and responsibilities for doing so. So those staff, definitely require more targeted, more focused training, but really all of your employees should be participating in your general information security awareness training to ensure that security is really top of mind across your entire organization. So really, what are some of the biggest or more immediate risks facing your institutions or higher education today? I think I'm going to ask Chad to kind of walk us through what we're seeing in the industry, and also sort of highlight some of the common findings his team gathers through their pen testing engagements. Chad?
Sure, thanks, Katie. So phishing attacks are not going to stop, and why? It's because they work. If you're receiving emails from unknown senders or from what appears to be known contacts, oftentimes those emails are going to include links. Their sender wants you to click on those or give up some information. Recently, my wife, she had been receiving emails from a smaller credit union that we use. Well, it appeared that it was saying that the phone number associated with the account had been changed and said, click here if you didn't authorize this change. It was really well crafted. The email address was spoofed. If she was in a hurry, she actually might have clicked on it. Of course, she knew to come to me and say, hey, take a look at this. But we're also seeing significant increase in attackers sending text messages, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But the biggest thing is when you're providing training to the users, they need to be taught what the warning signs, what the red flags are, and to be diligent in everything that they do, because we're probably all guilty of this. We rush through email, might miss those red flags. If it's the end of the day, beginning of the day, or returning from a holiday or something like that, we're going to rush. We're going to miss those red flags, and we need to make sure that we don't. So one definition of social engineering is the art of manipulating people into performing actions or divulging confidential information. We already talked about probably the most prevalent form of that social engineering, that's phishing. But the first example here we have is impersonating a coworker or boss. Kind of hits close to home for us here at CampusGuard. Over the last year, we've had attackers impersonating our CEO by sending us text messages. One of our penetration testers actually strung along the attacker for a while, but what they wanted to do is they wanted us to purchase gift cards and send them out to them. The attackers, they did a little bit of research on our company, but not enough to avoid their attack attempts being riddled with red flags. Just how somebody speaks or talks, or they put a signature in the text. It just things that wouldn't normally happen. So for us, it was pretty easy to spot, but they're becoming more and more frequent. Attackers, they're going to want you to give them access to information. They're going to want, access into systems, and they're likely to use emotions against us. There's 5 general emotions that are utilized by attackers. That's urgency, greed, curiosity, helpfulness, and fear. I think if you break down any phishing emails or texts that you get, you're going to find probably one of these 5 emotions tied to that. If I was to target somebody during a social engineering engagement that we're doing for you, I'm going to start by gathering information about you, your associates. Going to likely use Google Foo, so the art of Googling information, public documents, social media accounts, things of that nature. People tend to overshare, thinking that the information that they're sharing is innocent enough, pictures of where they went to eat, favorite foods, different things, but a lot of these can be tied to security questions as well. So people don't always understand what details can be gleaned from what they are sharing. From an organizational perspective, what can be done to combat social engineering risks? The obvious is we need to train our users. We need to make sure that they know what to be looking for, but also we can look at documenting who has access to what, outlining the approval processes, for example, when making financial transactions, what that takes, visitor management, and training them on incident reporting. So passwords, big topic here. We could spend an entire presentation about the risks of bad password habits. It is 2023, so I think it's pretty embarrassing that password or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or variations of those are still in the top lists for commonly used passwords. But just about as bad as having weak password is using the same password across multiple sites or accounts. Breaches are inevitable when they happen. It's a matter of when they happen, not if they're going to happen. So if a website gets breached and account details are leaked, that password, no matter how complex or good it is, will forever be on some list somewhere. So attackers, us penetration testers, we have compiled lists of these passwords from breaches, and we will attempt to use them in what's called the credential stuffing attacks. So we use, known passwords that were already set and see if we can utilize or gain some account access that way. Or we're going to use hashes of the passwords to compare to other compromised password hashes in an attempt to recover clear text credentials to further our attacks. Does your organization use default passwords that IT set up? The IT department sets up when setting up new accounts, resetting passwords. Maybe it's welcome one exclamation or your mascot 2023 exclamation. When we're performing pen tests, it's one of the easiest and most successful ways to gain access to a system is using password spraying. I don't have the actual statistic, but I would say a good 90% plus of our pen tests, that's how we get our initial access into an environment. So trying a single password across multiple accounts, we're going to gather as many usernames as we can, which is unbelievably easy in the higher ed space because most of the schools, thank you very much, have a directory right on their public web page. And then we're going to attempt to use those passwords that we're guessing against all of the accounts. You'd be surprised at how many times, winter 2022 exclamation is used and has gotten us access into accounts. So season, year, and a special character at the end. But even if you have multi-factor authentication deployed, we still need to be training our users at least until passwords go away. That's, I think, quite a bit down the road, but we need to be training them on how to create secure passwords, and better yet, probably passphrases. IT departments should be requiring password changes at a frequency that aligns with the rest of the password policy. So I think historically it's been a 90 days is industry standard. But I would say that if you're only requiring 8 characters, which isn't very good, you should be changing them more often. If you're requiring 15 characters plus, maybe less frequent. But we should also be training on and have offerings for password management. If we're not using the same password across all accounts and websites, you probably have dozens of passwords at a minimum. So use a reputable password manager that's going to be secured using a strong passphrase that is protecting that password database and not used elsewhere. So something very, very unique to that. And then you can store all your passwords within that password database. It's going to enable those users to be able to have those unique passwords without having to remember them all. And at the enterprise level, there's password vaults that are available, either commercial, there might be some open source offerings as well, but they can store the organizational account credentials, and they should be heavily logged to identify any abuses or unauthorized activity.
Okay, awesome. And thanks, Chad. I think before we go into the next slides and next risks, when we're talking about phishing, we were going to kick off a quick poll to the audience. Kathy, if you want to go ahead and bring that up now. Yes, so just a couple of questions, if everybody can answer these, just how often you're phishing your employees, whether that's monthly, every 6 months, annually, rarely, or never. And then if you are performing regular password audits. Yes, no, sometimes, or what is a password audit? And we're definitely going to go into a little bit more about password audits later in the webinar with Chad. So I'll give you just a couple minutes to answer these 2 questions. And then Kathy, just let me know when you're ready to close that out and we'll do a quick review. Everybody take a second to answer that question. All right, I think we can probably close it. There we go. All right, so thanks everybody for the feedback. It looks like about half of you are doing phishing tests, kind of varies a little bit in the frequency. And then, 20% are doing those password audits, actually 40% yes, and sometimes. And then about a third of you ask about what a password audit is. So that's great. I think Chad will, like I said, definitely sort of go through what that is and how it can be used to help measure the effectiveness of your ongoing security awareness training too when we get there. So thank you for that. All right, so I did want to cover just a couple of other risks that are also important to consider when you're building out your training. This is a more or less technical risk, but still really important, just vulnerable document processes. So if you have staff maybe printing or scanning sensitive information and leaving it in the printer or the copy machine before they retrieve it, or maybe they're just leaving papers, out on their desks or when they go home for the day or when they go to lunch. If you have employees storing documents in paper files or in unlocked file cabinets, do they keep sensitive data on servers? Are they using unencrypted file shares or Google Drives or even applications like Dropbox? And then you also want to know if they're emailing sensitive information to personal email accounts or other internal contacts. I think with so many of us moving to remote working, employees might be more apt to do this so they can access files they need when they're working from home in the evenings or on the days they might be working remotely. So all of these are really items that should be covered in your training so employees know what is acceptable. They need to know how to protect paper data and how to handle those different types of sensitive data. And really what applications have been approved for storage and transmitting information. So within your training, you might want to talk a little bit about what applications they can use, what they can't, and then also make sure they understand where they can go to find out that information. And all of that should be outlined within your policies and procedures. And then the last risk I want to talk about today before we move on is just the use of third parties in outsourcing services. In the most recent cost of a data breach report, we saw that 20% of breaches are actually caused by compromised third-party vendors, and the cost of the breach actually rises from $4.34 million to $4.46 million when a third party is involved. So I know we've seen a couple kind of high-profile breaches recently in higher ed that have had a pretty big impact across the industry, with multiple customers impacted. And we've also seen some increased attention from the Department of Ed recently. So this could be, and probably should be, another topic for a whole other webinar. But at a high level, when we're focusing on training, we just want to make sure that all of the departments and staff know your procedures for contracting with vendors. You want to make sure no one's going rogue, signing a contract without approval, and also ensure that the departments understand the need to track and monitor all of the vendors that they're partnered with ongoing. And then lastly, just how to respond if a vendor does notify them or you hear about a potential breach that impacts the customers that might be using that product. But before we really dive in to kind of how you can start building out that content and educating staff on those risks we just covered, I want to turn it over to Margaret to discuss some of the requirements based on the different industry standards and requirements. So Margaret, I know you spent a lot of years working in higher ed, so you know how complex it is. So can you talk a little bit about what is actually required for training?
Sure, thank you, Katie. So as it turns out, awareness training is not just a best practice. That is something that's great to do. There are certainly several requirements and frameworks and in the regulatory space that compel training as a requirement. So just wanted to touch on a few of these. So in PCI, I think any of you who are familiar with PCI DSS compliance have known that there is a training requirement, and that's been in place for years. And that requirement has been around general information security awareness training at the point of hire and annually. Also, there is training around the point of interaction, the place where the cards are actually taken at the payment card terminal. The awareness efforts there would be around tampering and checking for rogue devices and odd behaviors in the cardholder data environment. But in version 4, the council has taken this to a whole new level. They've added new requirements around specific types of training. For example, training now has to include phishing awareness and social engineering awareness. So For those of you in our poll who indicated that you are not phishing your employees, you're going to need to start once 4.0 becomes the master PCI DSS standard. So the other training requirements around 4.0 have to do with acceptable use and training your employees to, use certain critical technologies appropriate, technologies such as email, even though your email server is not hopefully in your cardholder data environment. I think a lot of folks hear this requirement and think, oh, no, wait, my CDE doesn't include email, but actually email can be a threat to your CDE wherever it is because of phishing and those types of threats that Chad touched on. So training also in 4.0 has to include incident response readiness for those who are involved in your incident response plan. Awareness training also is something that must be refreshed annually and kept current with evolving threats. So moving on to GLBA, the requirement has been that your GLBA training is compelled upon all staff and has to be updated now with the new version, final rule of GLBA. It is also going to compel the requirement that you are performing awareness training that is relevant to specific threats that are identified in your risk assessments that you're all doing in GLBA for GLBA compliance. Your awareness training has to be kept up to date, and your security staff also have to demonstrate that they're taking steps to maintain and keep their knowledge relevant to the threat landscape up to date. And HIPAA has been fairly steady. Employees are to receive training under the privacy rule and security rule. For audit purposes, this means keeping up with your documentation on the types of training that you're offering, the materials, and the evidence of your workforce participation. So moving on to CMMC, this one is evolving. And what's happening is it's becoming more and more in line with NIST 800-171 and now 800-172, where there are more specific training requirements related to keeping current on evolving threats, much in the same way that PCI and GLBA are evolving. 172 addresses training as a control where your organizational system users are to be trained on the specific risks associated with their use of those systems, and also the consequences of their actions and the associated policies that your organization publishes for use of those systems. And in 172, the training is expanded to employees needing to be trained on recognizing the current threats and threats along the lines of advanced persistent and insider threats, as well as social engineering and behavioral techniques. These training activities need to include exercises where you are testing your employees. So there is obviously a theme here that the different prevailing compliance requirements in the space. So lastly, with Fair and Accurate Credit Reporting, Credit Transactions Act, the requirements around just building your awareness into an identity theft program, training your employees to help respond to red flags. And there are other compliance requirements out there, but I did also want to mention that you want to keep in mind now cyber insurance providers are requiring awareness training, many of them even requiring testing of your employees. So just going back to phishing awareness, this is something that should involve testing. So I'm going to turn it back over to Katie. Thank you.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Margaret. I'm sure we'll have some more questions on those requirements, but now that we've reviewed kind of at a high level what topics you should cover and what you have to cover, wanted to talk a little bit about how you can start creating that content, whether you're making it internally or if you're finding external or outsourced content, but how best to structure your courses or the modules that your employees are all going to be tasked with completing. So I guess my general advice, don't just throw something out there at your staff to check a compliance box. You really want to provide content to get employees to pay attention, get employees to change their behaviors, and provide that high quality content that's both engaging and really relevant to their roles. So one thing to keep in mind is that even though you want training to be created by security experts like Margaret and Chad, and those credentialed experts, for the general users, you do have to keep it somewhat friendly. It can't be too technical, and it's important to incorporate topics that apply both to their personal and their professional lives. So some different topics we want to make sure are included within the training should be things like protecting home computers, mobile device security, Wi-Fi security, how to create and remember secure passwords, and physical security. With so many people working at home and in hybrid environments, it's important to make sure your training aligns with your policies for remote work and kind of helps them make sure they're setting up those home environments securely. Training might review things like VPN use requirements, using work issued versus home or personal equipment, requirements for using up-to-date operating systems, anti-malware and antivirus protection, as well as policies on sharing information outside of your organization, those approved file sharing tools, and then acceptable use. And then like Margaret mentioned and Chad talked about, you definitely want to make sure training is covering things like social engineering attacks, looking out for suspicious or unauthorized visitors, talks about phishing and vishing and smishing and all the ishings apparently. And then training should also share examples of those phishing messages and kind of walk users through how to identify the different warning signs or red flags, and also where to report if they do notice something is off. And then lessons should include real-world examples or stories of organizations that have been impacted. So for example, you might want to illustrate how a response to a single phishing email actually led to a larger data breach or a ransomware attack at another institution by sharing those real-world stories from your specific industry. So I think for a lot of you on today, if we talk about stories from college or university environments, that'll definitely be more impactful for your users. And then finally, your training should also review best practices for protecting information. So you want to include things like your data classification policy, data retention, secure information disposal, and then you want to align your training with your operational procedures. So making sure that overall messaging and instruction is consistent. So if you can customize training, you'll want to provide direct links to your policies within the training. Make sure your staff know where and how to find specific policies and procedures. So you might even want to structure an FAQ document on maybe some of the common requests that your help desk is receiving or common requests you get from your staff, and have that information readily available on your website. You can also use your training to help push for adoption of policies. So if they can tie everything together with that consistent messaging, it just really reinforces adherence to your organizational procedures and why they're there in the first place. And you can even build in acknowledgements of understanding into your training. So this would be things like your acceptable usage policy, access control, talking about administrative rights and why users aren't allowed to have them, and then incident management and response. And then finally, as much as you can, if you can set up personalized campaigns targeted to those specific roles and responsibilities. So for example, with PCI, as Margaret mentioned, you'll have PCI training for anybody involved with the card data, but PCI training for merchant managers is going to be a lot different than it would be for just a student or a student cashier. And it's different for IT staff responsible for securing systems and implementing the technical controls. So as much as we can have that training role-based, it will help. And making sure it's focusing on challenges the employees are seeing in their everyday roles. So for example, again, like the business office might receive more focused training on ACH payment fraud or email compromise attacks, as those seem to be more and more common in targeting those financial accounts. So as we talked about earlier, if you can review specific risks to sensitive data types the users are accessing, you want to make sure you have certain controls for securing PHI data, different controls for research data, financial aid data, kind of target the training as much as you can. And then as much as possible, even though I know it can be hard to make training fun, it should be engaging. You should build in different interactive elements or games, use videos, and then also make sure you're using knowledge tests or quizzes at the end of each section, just to make sure the users are fully understanding and absorbing the information they're being presented with. So we want employees to walk away from the training feeling like they learned something, make them feel like they have all the information to be empowered to make decisions in their jobs, and then change their behaviors to implement the best practices they just learned. And then one of the other common questions we get a lot from our customers is just how often they should be training staff, how often is really necessary to train employees. So it's just important to balance the time you're asking staff to use for training against the other responsibilities they're tasked with. As a general rule, staff should receive security awareness training upon hire as part of their onboarding, but then it should also become ongoing throughout the year. So whether that's through quarterly or monthly training courses, you just want to keep it top of mind. And if you can provide training in smaller, bite-sized or micro-sized modules that make it easier for them to complete those requirements and digest the materials, as well as build that awareness ongoing. So I'd recommend keeping training windows shorter. So if you send out a training, give it maybe a 30-day deadline. If a user sees a due date way out in the future, if you give them 3 months to complete the training, they aren't as likely to be motivated to log in and take that training upon initial notification, because they'll think there's time to procrastinate like we all do and come back to it later. So I would keep those windows shorter. You can also plan for different themes monthly. You can have, a training in October for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, maybe something around data privacy in January for Data Privacy Month, and then you could target phishing one month or physical security the next. And then you can supplement training with additional resources, things like posters or sending out a newsletter with different articles, infographics, videos, lessons learned. And it's always helpful to utilize adults from different or alerts from industry sites like Krebs on Security or CISA, or you can definitely check out the CampusGuard newsletter, just different ways to share information out with your staff and keep them thinking about security. So as Margaret mentioned, some of those requirements require an annual review of your training program, but we definitely want to make sure it's being evaluated regularly, changing and updating the training with new or escalating risks or threats, updates to any requirements. And then obviously users don't want to take the same course over and over and over each year. So providing that updated content is important. And then you can always involve your users too, if you want to survey staff for feedback, find out what they liked, what they didn't like, if it was easy to understand, accessibility requirements, or make sure they kind of valued the information that they were receiving, or even set up a user group and a user experience group and have them rate their overall experience and provide feedback so that you can use that input to improve the training ongoing. And with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Margaret. Anything else you've seen that's worked well at your previous institutions to kind of build that culture of awareness, or how you're able to gain support for training ongoing?
So I guess on that note, one of my previous institutions actually used a lot of swag, found that is something that can be helpful. Everyone likes free stuff. And we also had an awareness staff member who would dress like a giant fish, which also seemed really popular with the students. So making training fun is something that we would love to do, because I think for so many of us, training, kind of like compliance, can be a bit of an annoying obligation. But if it's used appropriately, I would say that compliance and training can both be used to kind of get that executive buy-in that you need to help you eliminate potential roadblocks, generate the sort of enforcement support that you need for your program, and help to allocate the much needed funding for training resources and other resources for your information security program. So as an example, GLBA now requires that the qualified individual or your CISO in many cases must provide a regular update to the board of directors. So I would say and ask you what better way there would be to kind of help you get that executive support by leveraging that opportunity to get your board of directors in a room and then use your training to illustrate what can happen if the proper resources and funding and enforcement is not there to help support your program. You can certainly illustrate what can happen during a security incident. Some people say never waste a good crisis. This sadly is a way that you can actually train your board of directors and other leaders about the importance of information security by walking them through what can happen in a possible event where you are losing resources, funding is threatened, you are exposing sensitive information online, just walking through the impact to your brand of your institution, showing all the soft and hard costs associated can be a powerful tool. So this is where you can actually take your risk assessments that you're all doing again and show the results of your risk assessments and show where you are likely to have issues and where an incident might actually occur, and taking a look at your current threats that you are keeping up with and adding into your awareness program. You're taking those threats and you're showing your leadership just how real those threats are by illustrating what can happen in other areas and other schools, other organizations where data breaches sadly are happening. And after all this, if you have used your compliance obligation and your training appropriately, you can hopefully get that executive buy-in that you really need to be able to move your organization forward. Katie?
Yes, thank you. So our final topic is just how you can really measure the effectiveness of your training. So it can be a little difficult to show immediate return on investment for training, but hopefully you can start tracking some different metrics that can then be shared with your executive team and the board, as Margaret mentioned, as improvements start to be made over time. So if you want to form a baseline now of where you're at today, then you can start monitoring results over time, like things like a reduction in system downtime or network and application outages. You might be able to see a reduction in malware outbreaks or PC performance issues. So that really helps you determine that users are maybe opening fewer malicious emails or clicking links that lead to issues. You might see a reduction in resources then spent on the help desk responding, and the reduction in help desk tickets for compromised machines. And then hopefully you'll also see an increase in employee engagement. You'll see a better recognition by personnel of phishing and social engineering attempts. So you'll see people reaching out to report phishing messages or asking questions of the help desk. And then your online training system should also provide progress reports for tracking user progress. So you can always report back on things like an increase in the number of personnel completing the training. You should be able to see an increase in comprehension. So if you take a look at those user scores on the quizzes or on those training assessments, you should see improvement over time. And then I did want to include chat on this slide too. I know they have some different tools, like we mentioned earlier, that you can use to kind of start tracking the effectiveness of your awareness training too.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I think a couple of the things that we offer services for on my team is, the hands-on phishing. We do the password audits, and I'll get into that in a second. But by getting a baseline, doing a phishing assessment, or understanding, kind of where your staff lies initially, and then bolstering your awareness training, and doing that phishing on a regular basis, we can see, are there different departments or are there different users that are still struggling with identifying those red flags and things that they need to be aware of when potential phishing emails do come in. And then we can track that over time. It's not a one size fits all with our team. So a phishing assessment isn't a phishing assessment isn't a phishing assessment, but we work with all of our customers to understand, what do you already have in place? What are you doing? Where are you seeing the struggles? Or maybe the answer is they haven't been doing it. As we saw, I think 40% were not doing phishing assessments on a regular basis. But we can start at the beginning, or we can kind of pick up from where you guys are at to be able to effectively track, how is this doing? How is this going for us? And is the awareness getting better overall? With the password auditing, we use different tactics there, but essentially we can either do what I mentioned earlier, and that's the password spraying to see how easily we can guess passwords by pulling down user accounts, usernames, and guessing those passwords. Or some institutions, they have us come in and we get a copy of their domain controller data. So essentially all that hashed, all those hashed passwords for all their users, and then we'll run them through password cracking algorithms using our hardware, and we see, okay, out of 10,000 users, in a 5-day span, we were able to crack 67% of those passwords, and maybe your password policy is this, but we recommend you make these changes to it. And then we could come back in and do the same thing again. And if that number is being driven down because of, user awareness or changing of policies to mitigate the risk there, I think that you can easily track, hey, we're making that progress, and maybe we make these additional tweaks and continue to drive on. So those are a couple of the things that we see our users benefit from.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Chad. So I think that wraps up the main strategies we wanted to cover with you today around training. It looks like we did allow, a little over 15 minutes for questions, and no one had to be told to unmute. So I'd say that was a success. But I'm going to turn it back over to Tess and Kathy and see what sort of questions we're getting so far. If you can send those questions in the chat, we can help to address those. Oh no, we failed. Tess, you're on mute.
Dang
no.
it, there it was.
Yeah, I jinxed
so
us.
much. You guys are doing such a great job. So we have our first question is from Jamie. Jamie says, this is my first webinar with you all. I am new to the industry, currently in training with PCI DSS validation. Will you have any more of these? Y'all are doing great. And Jamie, I completely agree. And we are planning on having more webinars. I can answer this one. We are going to have more webinars. The best way to keep in touch and tell what we're going to do next is to subscribe to our newsletter. You can do that on our website, CampusGuard.com, or you can follow us on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. So we have another question. It says, I've been reading articles on mandatory password changes recently. My current understanding is that employees tend to use weaker passwords or simpler patterns in order to remember their passwords when they frequently change. Are there any articles about the benefits of frequent mandatory password changes?
I could take that. I don't have the answer about recent articles. I probably have to take that as a takeaway. I know that industry standards and NIST, they're reframing how it's always been, because like I said, 90 days was kind of that industry standard. But if you look at the complexity of a password and the there's all kinds of articles on depending on how complex it is, with this kind of computing power, you can crack a password in so long, and you want to make sure that entropy is high enough, and that's the complexity and how long it'll take to crack. You want to make sure that's high enough so the passwords are being rotated before somebody could crack it should they get that password hash. I would say that again, 15 characters or more, if it's not something simple like CampusGuard 2023 exclamation, right? It's going to be harder for us and attackers to be able to crack those passwords. So I would say still setting it on a regular basis is good. You don't want to never let them expire. And here's why. We get into an environment, we're likely to get into a computer or a system that actually has the password stored in hash value. If we can crack that within a certain time frame, we now have that clear text password, or we can pass that hash along even if we don't have clear text. But if you're rotating those passwords on a frequency, that password becomes irrelevant at the next password change. So there's still kind of that trade-off between requiring the password changes at a set interval, but it goes to I guess the security of your environment and the complexity of the password kind of comes into play there. I would say email Tessa, Kathy, after the webinar, and I could certainly find some resources to be able to send your way.
Awesome. So another question that we have, what is the best way to ensure our training program meets all of our compliance obligations?
I guess y'all left that for me because it's, she mentioned the word compliance. So that's a really good question. You know, if you don't have someone at your organization who is like me and who is kind of monitoring a little bit what you're doing, you really do have to pay attention to the requirements and how they are changing, so that the fact that the different prevailing frameworks and regulations are now moving toward longer passwords, for example, and the use of multi-factor authentication. You, with your training, you can certainly take what you see repeated through all of these regulations and requirements, and take the highest bar, take the one that has the most specific in terms of training requirements, and build your program around that one. For me, when I was working in higher ed, I frequently went to the PCI DSS to sort of pull all of, many of the controls and the requirement recommendations for my users. So around training and around almost, every control where you are interacting with your end users, looking to PCI DSS for many of those requirements, such as training, can really help you cover all of your bases and stay, informed. Make sure that you subscribe to, certainly to our listserv. We put out a lot of blogs and a lot of other information to kind of help you stay up to date with all these requirements. Watch this seminar. We're going to record it. We're going to send it out. You can, have all of that at the ready if you sign up for our webinars, and certainly reach out to us. Those of you who are our customers certainly have access to us. You can also, visit our website for different blogs and articles that we post, and we will do our best to keep you informed.
Okay, another question. Are there internal use tools for auditing passwords that do not cost a fortune?
Yes, the short answer is yes. There's a lot of open source tooling. When we as offensive security professionals, we look for tools, maybe we've been using a particular tool, but there's just a gap in what we need or what we're looking for, or some different functionality. The InfoSec community is great. They've got people are creating things, and there might be a tool that does that, but there's 20 other ones as well. GitHub is a real good place. I would say you can do a little bit of research to find what tool fits your needs. Like I said, GitHub's a good place for open source. Download that tool in a testing environment. Make sure it's doing what you want it to do. Evaluate that. But I think that, that's probably the easiest way to get started versus, there's commercial products out there as well, and they're probably great. They probably offer support, with that payment plan or whatever you're subscribing to. But I would say start with open source, because you're going to understand what you need to do, what you can do, and where you need to go from there. Figure out, what you might be lacking, what you might still need. And then if a commercial tool fits that bill, you can move on up to that.
And then our last question, all of you can give tips. Do any of you have tips on how to make a security training session more engaging?
I think I can start, and then I'll let Margaret and Chad jump in. But I think just making users have to interact more with the training when they come in and take training, so they can't, make it start playing on one slide and then go back to their email and just kind of pretend like they're listening to it, and actually get sidetracked and start working on something else. So making users have to engage with the training, maybe, have to play a little game or have to click something to proceed. I think that's really important. And just including things like videos, having different characters talking, maybe some different games where they have to slide something over to pick an answer, anything like that just helps it become more engaging. And then Margaret and Chad, I'll let you guys fill in too.
So I'll add, I know this is not a popular one, but having done both, if you consider live training versus sort of the recorded training, I have given both. I have, in one of my previous institutions, I gave the new hire security awareness training on an every 2 weeks basis for a few years. And I always found that when compared to sort of canned training, that there was a lot more engagement, to Katie's point, and there's that tendency to pay attention, whether it's sort of that human sort of guilt or, sort of the fact that there's an actual live person there who wants to see that you are engaged versus someone, who can't see you and can't interact with you. I think the live training is certainly something that helps to, be more of a rewarding experience, I think, for everybody who is involved, in those people who tend to kind of think it's a drag and want to just turn on their Pandora and, put their training on mute. So definitely the engagement, and I would kind of take it to another level and say, every once in a while, try to have some form of live training to break up the monotony there.
Yeah, I think for me, I don't like to see the same content year after year. I came from the DoD space, and there, if anybody's ever taken the training, there's, what I'm talking about. It was like the same training. It was so boring. It was the same individual that was kind of narrating or pictured in the training, and it really got boring year after year. So that'd be the first thing. Have relevant, updated content. The involvement, I think, is a real good one. But I would also say that the swag is a really good idea. Whether it's like, hey, the first, maybe not the first 10 people that get it done, but out of everybody that gets their training done in the first 7 to 14 days, we're going to send swag out to 10 people or something like that. Kind of that lottery. I think that may help get people, like Margaret said, everybody loves free stuff. And I think that if there's a chance to get a little something more out of it, but having those real world examples of either what's happened with your institute or organization or within the industry, I think that makes it more interesting and relevant, because you start thinking, hey, I don't want to be the person that causes this for our organization. So
Okay, well, that's it for questions.
Well,
think-
I was just going to say, speaking of free stuff, since we mentioned it and everyone loves free stuff, we do have a contest going on right now at CampusGuard. So if you haven't already participated, we just wanted you to sort of have some fun with it and brainstorm either a famous celebrity or a fictional character and think about what would happen if they were in charge of your organization's information security program. So we had some examples out here. You know, if Beth Dutton was in charge of your information security program, everyone would probably listen and probably jump right on that training so they didn't get, you know, left at the border of Montana and Wyoming. So these are just some ideas, but you can definitely think of your own. If you want Chuck Norris to be in charge of your training, if you want, you know, Taylor Swift in charge of your training, just let us know. Send a quick little comment back. All of the details are out on the CampusGuard blog. You can send your idea in and there is a chance to win a free Amazon gift card. So definitely check it out.
Thank you so much. So I just wanted to thank our presenters today. Thank you, Katie, Margaret, and Chad for your information. We hope everybody found this content valuable and informative. Just wanted to remind everybody really quickly that an email will be going out with the presentation deck as well as the link to the webinar in the next couple of days. And also real quick, if you have a couple of seconds, once we exit the webinar, a very brief survey will pop up, just a few questions if you have time. We would love to hear your feedback on what you thought of the content and also a couple questions about your own security awareness program. So just with that, wanted to say thank you for everybody for joining, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everybody.
y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.